I understand economists are going to talk about this childcare, elder care, da da da. But then when you
Mm,
talk about it too much as an economist, you then end up saying things like we have to relieve parents of the burden of care. Yeah, parents need help, but if you're saying we need to give everybody 40 hours a week of institutional subsidized universal daycare so that they can go off and make their jobs. No, some people have kids because they want to spend time with their kids.
yeah,
And so that seeing everything like an economist goes hand in hand with that hyper individualism. And
yeah.
I call it a sort of a sterilized worldview.
Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Program here at the Macdonald Laurier Institute. And welcome to Inside Policy Talks, our in-house policy podcast where we bring together leading thinkers to discuss the policy shaping Canada's future, and in today's case, the United States as well. And today we'll be diving into one of the most pressing challenges facing both Canada and the US, the intersection of housing policy, family formation, and social stability. Housing affordability has become a dominant issue here in Canada with skyrocketing home prices and rental costs, making it harder for young people to start families and put down roots. And the question we're going to be discussing is, to what extent is this just a market problem, or is it tied to something deeper, cultural shifts, government regulation, and the weakening of community institutions? And to explore these questions, I'm joined today by Tim Carney, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Tim has written extensively on the decline of civil society and the policies that have undermined strong communities, particularly in his book Alienated America, and most recently about how various aspects of our culture are family unfriendly in his book by the same name. And he's been at the forefront of the debate on how public policy shapes social well-being. And today we're going to discuss how housing policy and economic pressures are influencing marriage rates, birth rates, and family stability on both sides of the border. So, Tim, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's dive right in, Tim. Much of your work examines how government policies shape communities and social structures. Could you start by giving us a broad overview of your key arguments, particularly in Alienated America, and then your most recent book, Family Unfriendly?
Sure. The phrase "the American dream" is one we absolutely love. And when Donald Trump ran for president the first time, he said the American dream is dead. That was the line that set up "Make America Great Again." He said it again and again. And I traveled around the country and following all the different candidates, and I found there was a widespread belief that the American dream was dead. And this was a little surprising. We had pretty good economy in 2016, but what was really plaguing so much of the United States was a collapse of, you could call it belonging, a collapse of community, that there was less and less did people know their neighbors, did people volunteer. There were fewer local coffee shops for people to hang out in and fewer houses of worship. There were fewer it used to be that 90% of pints of beer consumed in the United States were consumed like in public with neighbors at a bar, at an event. And then it fell down to less than 50. Mostly people are drinking at home alone, or maybe just with their family. And so that bowling alone, drinking alone, whatever you want to call it, that phenomenon really explained so much of the suffering in the US. And some of it is, and I mean, by that, I mean, deaths of despair, that's drug overdoses, alcohol abuse, suicide. It explained the retreat from marriage. It explains this lack of belonging, also explains falling birth rates. And what are the causes of that? Some of it's technology, some of it's policy, some of it is just sort of changing values in the West, in the US, Canada, Europe, et cetera. And so those are the topics that I explore. I think the most important story of the last 30 years is the collapse of community. And I think the most important story going forward is going to be the retreat from marriage and the falling birth rates.
Yeah. So just before we move on to housing in particular connected to this question, do you care elaborating on these trends? You noted bowling alone. This was an argument put
Mhm.
forward by Robert Putnam many decades ago now. And so is it just continued apace, further exacerbating the issue, or how do you unpack it a little bit?
Yeah, when Robert Putnam wrote Bowling Alone, it came out in the year 2000. The bowling image was that people still go bowling, but they don't join leagues, and there's less volunteering. There's fewer libraries around. And one of his chapters in Bowling Alone was on religious congregations, and he noted that half of all civic activity originates from religious congregations, whether it's sports leagues or serving the poor or taking care of the elderly, etc. And that decline has certainly accelerated in the United States of people who attend church, which again is the most important institution of civil society, just numbers wise. That has definitely fallen in the last 25 years. Even religious people are more likely to sort of be individualistic rather than communitarian in their worship.
Mhm.
Marriage rates obviously have fallen in the last 25 years, and all of those different measures of volunteering have accelerated, as has the sense of loneliness, the
Mhm.
being alienated from your neighbors. When Putnam wrote Bowling Alone, the iPhone didn't exist. You couldn't order your groceries to be delivered. And so these other great modern conveniences accelerate our detachment from our neighbors and our community.
Mm. Yeah, very good. So we'll return to some of these themes, but in connection to this issue of declining community institutions and social fragmentation, how is housing affordability fit into this discussion?
Well, I said I think the biggest story going forward is the falling birth rates, falling marriage rates. And a lot of people assume that that's just about affordability. And I've argued in articles I've written at the Washington Examiner, and I argue with lots of data in Family and Friendly, that affordability, for the most part, is not actually a very good explanation for these trends away from family. Where daycare costs go up, that doesn't necessarily predict a greater decline in the birth rate geographically
Mhm.
in the U.S. When more people have more student debt, even controlling for other factors, that doesn't predict really a delay in marriage any more than them going to school will postpone marriage, but them having more student debt doesn't seem to predict it. Affordability of groceries, all of these different things seem not to correlate with where birth rates fall more or where they don't fall.
Mhm.
The one exception to that is the cost of owning a home and maybe the cost of renting a home.
Mm.
And I don't know how much this is an American thing, but Americans want to own a house if they're starting a family or having
Mhm.
children, having a second child. A house with a yard is something that is the vision of family for a lot of Americans. And so when that gets more expensive, and this has been shown in studies in England as well as the US, when buying a house and owning one becomes more expensive, people are less likely to get married, less likely to have the next child. So
Mhm.
again, this has been done in studies, whether it's interest rates or the actual asking price of a house, both of those things deter family formation. One of the reasons is that uh, where you live really matters. Living next door to or around the corner from your mother is actually statistically proven to make it more likely that you'll have a second or third kid. If you
Mhm.
get help from your next door neighbors, from your in-laws, and from your neighborhood in general in raising your first child, you're much more likely to have a second child. So if you say, all right, maybe I'll just luck out and wherever I can find a house will be a good neighborhood, that's really inferior to what so many people have done for generations, which is to say, okay, maybe when we get married, we'll live in a small apartment, but then we're going to buy our family house as close to grandma as possible.
Yeah.
When that becomes a pipe dream, family formation becomes more of a distant dream and less of a
Mhm.
reality.
Right. Well, very good. Very interesting. So two questions: policy approaches to deal with the cost or availability supply of housing question, and then others that you reference in your most recent book, Family Unfriendly. Things pertaining to urban design, like walkability, even like zoning laws, municipal policies that contribute to perhaps the lack of supply or the lack of a supply of kind of family friendly urban and suburban environments.
Yeah. So on the housing, what let me start with what we should not do. Do not try to subsidize demand. Don't give, and this is one of there's a really bad idea floated in our presidential race of helping of giving people money to buy a house. We did
Mhm.
this 20 years ago. This caused the financial crisis. It just bids up the price of house. It leads to people buying houses where they can't afford the mortgage and then they end up defaulting. So government subsidizing buyers is not a good plan. There's some debate over whether government should subsidize builders. I generally think government subsidies for industry or individuals end up causing more problems than they solve.
Mhm.
And that our first step should be look at what are the regulations that make it unprofitable for builders to build houses that are more sort of human scale. In other words, where I used to live in this really expensive suburb of DC called McLean, Virginia. And every single house that got bought basically got torn down, and the new house put up was 5,000 square feet or more. Builders will build that 5,000 square foot house. Otherwise, they will build an apartment building. There's nothing wrong with big houses. There's nothing wrong with apartment buildings. But what a family really needs and wants is basically like a duplex or a what we call a starter home. Maybe it's
Mhm.
1,200 square feet and it has a postage stamp of a backyard but you could fence that in, put a picnic table, and let your toddler run around the backyard. And you might need bunk beds if you have a third kid, and that's fine, but you buy that house, you start your family there, and then maybe later you're able to then sell that house and move to a bigger one. But that doesn't get built in the United States anymore because it's not economical for the builders. And one of the reasons is the fixed costs of regulation. If every house, I mean, there are some fixed costs that are based in the market, right? Buying the land, buying a lot costs the same whether you're going to build a small house or a big house on it. But a lot of the fixed costs are permitting, are regulations. And some of those
Mhm.
regulations are, make sure this house doesn't fall down. But a lot of those regulations are actually unnecessary, and that
Mhm.
reviewing those from top to bottom, every county, every state should be going ahead, every city should be going ahead and doing that and saying, what are we doing to create obstacles to building smaller homes for a family to live in?
Yeah, just on that point, Tim, it's a theme that kind of runs through your book, and I dare say it's characteristic of our society more generally. Perhaps it's well, partly to do with values, but maybe partly even to do with wealth. We seem to be um, more able and willing now to look for more rules, more
Yep.
activity, more prescription to deal with any issue. And you see it with overparenting, even,
Yeah.
which you talk about it affects this, and you also see it with respect to regulations. So you think we're going to have a safer house or more aesthetically pleasing or um, setbacks from the road, these sorts of things. But the net effect seems to be running counter to some of the aims that are most pressing in our society today, namely just the ability to make the homes that are demanded. So you mentioned looking at some way to remove some of this excess here in the housing regulation sector. But what does that realistically look like? Are there some good examples of places that have done it, or are there some things in particular that you can point to that go, okay, that's really not necessary and something that we could easily forego?
Yeah, so I mean, there some of the issues are really tricky because in some places they talk about just the single family zoning and getting rid of that. But a lot of people, Americans, like our suburbs and a bunch of single family houses. And again, that's what a lot of people want. And I say a single family house or a duplex or a townhouse. That's the townhouse is like a pretty acceptable second best to a lot of people. But a lot of people, when they have kids, are ready to move out of the apartment at that point. They don't want to
Mhm.
be bringing the stroller into the elevator or up and down the stairs. And so that's a tricky one because that is something that drives up the cost of buying a house, is if you can't have a duplex or a set of garden apartments. On the story of apartments, though, one of the reasons that apartments in the US are so family unfriendly is that and this was a bizarre regulation that I stumbled across while I was, not a bizarre regulation, but I never thought about it until I was working on family unfriendly. And I found this whole subset of online people on Twitter who were obsessed with the double staircase rule. In basically every state in the US, if you build an apartment building that's more than 2 stories, you have to have 2 staircases on every floor. In most cases, that means the apartment building can only have one shape, which is a corridor with no windows running down the middle, and then apartments lined up like books on a bookcase on both sides. And what that means, it's harder to build you have one bedroom basically that gets all the light and nothing else. And it's harder to build a mix of different houses. If you've been in a nice old apartment building, you'll know, wait a second, there are 3 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, studio apartments. There's a mixture. But a lot of that has to do with, is made possible by there being just a single core, a
Mhm.
staircase up the middle. Again, this sounds totally obscure and weird, but the 2 staircase thing is a fire safety thing. And
Yeah.
these are people who are not libertarians. They're usually liberal urbanists who are like, this regulation has not saved a single life. There's no evidence that the 2 staircase regulation makes anybody safer. If we can just get rid of that, then small, like 4-story apartment buildings could be built in a more family friendly way. That's
Mhm.
one thing. Certainly, places that have minimum lot sizes, people like the character of that neighborhood. Your neighbor is further away, yada yada. I'm not
Mhm.
saying that that has no value, but right now, when we have a crisis of housing affordability up in Canada, you guys have it more acutely. It seems that you got to say, all right, I'm sorry. We are going to actually let you subdivide your 2 acre house into your 2 acre property
Mhm.
into, 4 different half-acre properties. So the
Mhm.
places that have had some success, Austin, Texas, basically gave a green light by speeding up a lot of the permitting, by doing away with some of the parking rules for new development. And so they have had housing keep up with the demand to move in there. There are other
Mhm.
pinch points. Some people, the restaurants are overcrowded. The schools are having trouble building quickly enough, but it's still, these are problems of success. And what's not happening is rising rents. In fact, they've seen rents coming down in a lot of Austin, Texas, because
Mhm.
the city, the county, the state have sort of said, go ahead and build. But
Right.
one of the problems when you ask what works is that a lot of the research, a lot of the urbanism that happens doesn't ask explicitly enough about families. That is, just increasing supply is good. I'm all for
Mhm.
that. But Tokyo, for instance, has massively increased its housing supply and kept housing costs fairly stable. But it's just massive apartment buildings that, again, don't prove to be family friendly. It seems to
Mhm.
accelerate their decline in their birth rate when people move from the countryside where these small towns are dying, move all into Tokyo, and you're on the 54th floor. That's not going to be family friendly almost no matter what. And so
Mhm.
there's got to be more research done on exactly this question. What is a family friendly housing policy? How do we get more stuff built, but in such a way that makes people say, this is a place where I can start my family, or this is a place where I can grow my family?
Mm, yeah, very interesting. So returning to this question of the primary drivers behind marriage and birth rates, many think that they're primarily economic conditions, but I think your work suggests that there are deeper cultural and structural
Hmm.
forces at play. So could you elaborate on those and then again how housing may intersect with these factors?
Sure. I mean, there's our former First Lady, Hillary Clinton, wrote a book 20, 30 years ago titled It Takes a Village to Raise a Child. And a
Mhm,
lot of American conservatives didn't like that, in part because we suspected that the village she was talking about was the federal government, like the Department of Health and Human
mhm.
Services.
Or displacing the family.
Yeah. Anybody who's raised kids knows that it actually does take more than two parents to raise children.
Of course.
You need the kids' grandparents, their aunts and uncles, their cousins. You need neighbors. You need a church community. You need a school community. You need youth coaches. You need somebody to hire them when they turn 14 or 15 or 16 for their job.
Mhm.
It takes so much support. You need mentors to for you to go to and be like, you know what, marriage is kind of hard, and someone to talk to about that. Or,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, why is my child behaving this way? To someone to tell
Mhm.
you this is a phase, don't worry about it. Or maybe that child's teething or something like that. So it takes so much. You need babysitters, all of that. And so the cultural trend that we were talking about earlier, the bowling alone, the collapse of
Mhm.
community, it is making it not only harder for parents to raise kids. When those things disappear, people stop even understanding that they could exist.
Mhm.
Put another way, alienation. Robert Nisbet was a great writer who said alienation is the not even seeing the purpose of society. So not I had this one journalist friend who he wrote this post on Twitter in two parts when he was expecting his first kid. He said part one was look up the cost of a night nurse, somebody to hire to stay overnight to wake up and stay up with the baby and feed and put her back to sleep when she wakes up. So that was step one. Look up the cost of a night nurse. Step two was research how to start a socialist revolution. In other words, the only sources he could see for support were the market and the state. And so this makes it even seem one of the reasons that raising kids seems so much more expensive than it used to be is because people don't think, oh, wait a second, I can rely on a carpool with my next door neighbor. Oh, wait a second, I could rely on, unpaid or below market rate babysitting from my family.
Mhm.
And so that's one major cultural thing. But as you suggested, I have lots of different aspects that I point to in the book of where culture is deterring marriage and driving down birth rates more than economics is.
No, yeah, that's it's really interesting how this kind of hyper individualism has coincided with reliance upon market or government entities
Yeah.
who provide everything for us, atomized
And that's what
cells.
Alexis de Tocqueville. I mean,
Yes, many.
everybody's got to read their Democracy in America, and he basically said that hyper individualism and over centralization are not opposites, but are two sides of the same coin. That as we
Mhm,
rely less on our neighbor, we rely more on the central power.
mhm.
And he's like a time traveler. He predicted that perfectly 200 years ago, and this is exactly what happens. And that hyper individualism really is a theme, and you see it across the political and ideological spectrum where
Mhm.
people think we love being rugged individualists. We all got, our ancestors got on a boat and came over here and we spread out across the country and we really value it. But in American history, that's always been balanced with or structured by community reliance.
Yeah.
And with that second part disappearing, the individualism becomes folly.
Mhm, mhm. Another interesting dimension to this issue is immigration. Recently in Canada, we had a considerable spike. I'm sure there have been some such spikes in the U.S., both uh, legal and illegal. Um, And, it's been a trend in many Western countries for latter half of the 20th century. And I'm sure it plays a role, in fact, in perhaps not directly, but indirectly discouraging focus on fertility and family formation, right? As we tend to rely upon it for economic issues. So, to what extent do you think the immigration issue is putting a strain on housing in particular, and then some of these other cultural civil society issues that you've pointed to?
Yeah, I mean, the intersection between immigration and family and community issues is very complicated. The first thing I would say is the what Canada's experience was extreme on this regard. Just increasing the legal immigration, increasing the population by so much through bringing in all those immigrants as a matter of policy is not something we've done here for a really long time, and that it would put a pinch on housing is the least surprising thing in the world. Um, what we've had in the last few years, I mean, basically, to put it a little bit bluntly, the Biden administration more or less legalized illegal immigration. And so that's going to interact differently when there are people who are here with questionable asylum claims. Uh, they're more likely to be transient, less likely necessarily to be buying or renting on the books. It's going to have an effect on housing, but we haven't had immigration as a broad driver in housing prices to the degree that Canada has. But what we do have, why did Europe start talking about the birth rate a decade ago and the United States, or 2 decades ago, and the United States just started talking about it basically yesterday? Well, as you said, immigration sort of covered up the issues. Right now, our working age population has just flatlined. But the only reason hasn't been shrinking for the last few years is immigration. And so if we had an actual shrinking working age population, we would have noticed, wait a second, we forgot to have babies 20 years ago. This is a problem. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is that immigration, foreign workers who come here are competing most directly with men who do not have college degrees. The working class male, his wages are bid down by immigrant labor. And so that is a huge part of the collapse in marriage and family formation is just working class men having trouble getting married. And so there's a good evidence that is about, we used to have factory union jobs and we have more mass immigration. On the other hand, every house that gets built in the United States gets built by an immigrant. And so if we don't have that labor coming in, the cost of building houses is going to go up. But there are certainly some people. There's actually a paper put out by Brookings Institution scholar Isabel Sawhill, where her title was, "We don't need more babies, we just need more immigrants." I think that's a totally foolhardy way of looking at things, in part because, I mean, this is where Europe sees the problem. If you say, oh, we need somebody to take care of us when we're older, we need somebody to do the service sector jobs, and that our kids aren't going to do. Deliberately creating an immigrant underclass is really not a recipe for social peace. And the United States has been really good at assimilating immigrants over the years. Not perfect, but I think better than anybody in Europe. And if the only young people are, that's an exaggeration, but if we're importing people to be our young workers, and we're creating such a clear distinction between sort of the served and the serving, and it's white versus Hispanic, which is largely what it is, or Indian. India and China are our second and third sources of immigration. Then that I think that's a recipe for the kind of discord you have in Europe.
Oh, a lot of interesting points there. It's amazing to me how, this kind of technocratic almost like policy wonk attitude to life issues. It's so like it's so crass and crude, and I mean,
Yeah.
just to think of yeah, like caregiving and social life and family as all replaceable and as burdens and things that you need
Yeah,
outsource.
the
Yeah.
burden of care is a real common term in the
Oh
American
yes, yeah.
media, and the care economy. And I understand economists are going to talk about this child care, elder care, da da da. But then when you
Mhm.
talk about it too much as an economist, you then end up saying things like we have to relieve parents of the burden of care. Yeah, parents need help, but if you're saying we need to give everybody 40 hours a week of institutional subsidized universal daycare so that they can go off and make their jobs, saying, no, some people have kids because they want to spend time with their kids.
Yeah,
And so that seeing everything like an economist goes hand in hand with that hyper individualism. And
yeah.
I call it a sort of a sterilized worldview where we all
Mhm,
become economic actors.
mhm.
And
Homo
it's
economicus.
even pronatalists sometimes talk this way, where they say,
Mhm.
well, you need to make tomorrow's workers. I'm like, that's true,
More to
but
life.
that's not how I see my 6 kids. I don't see them. I
Yeah,
will joke that we are keeping Social Security solvent into the future. But if one becomes a monk and the others become like stay-at-home moms or subsistence farmers, I don't feel I've failed because they're
yeah.
not contributing to the economy.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And it's interesting. We had Oren Cass up here in visiting Canada at a tense time, but he emerged unscathed. And I think it's really helpful to point out that when you view the world this way, even in pure kind of economic welfare terms, I mean the effect over time is going to be negative because
Yep.
people are not meant to treat everyone just like cogs in a machine as utility maximizing entities. This actually decreases our productivity and our health
Yes.
and our well-being. So it's really like welfare maximizing, not in just a crude GDP sense, but in the richer sense of human flourishing, to have policies that are conducive to the
No,
full
and
experience of human life.
it gives I in parts of the book I make it clear I have a Christian anthropology. I'm a Catholic. I see humans as having innate value that's immeasurable. But I also make the argument that even if you were just a crude utilitarianism doesn't work. The happiness utility maximizing society is one where we love our neighbors and lay down our lives for other people, not
Mhm,
out of some calculation of reciprocity, but out of
mhm,
sort of a broad attitude of reciprocity. That I mean,
mhm,
and that's why social trust is so important. And
yes.
I always think of when a good neighborhood is where like the kids' bikes are left on the front yard, and just think of how much easier that makes everything. There was a while where my children just would not stop stealing the snacks. So you buy in bulk at Costco when you have 6 kids. So the snacks they need for school. And we had to put an alarm on the pantry closet and put everything up on a real high shelf to stop them from stealing it. And at that point, they couldn't pack their own lunch. And I just said, kids, this is how a low trust society makes everybody poorer.
Very good. Did they get
And
it? Did they laugh?
they didn't appreciate it. No.
Okay, well, give them a few more years.
I appreciated it, and you do too. So it was worth it.
Very
So
good. That's great, Tim. Let's start talking about some solutions or
hmm
ways to ameliorate the situation. Models of high fertility and family formation, family-friendly cultures. Um, Thinking of places like Israel,
yep.
France, of Hungary. What do they do? What are they doing right that we don't do here in North America when it comes to housing and family formation?
Sure. I mean, it's really tricky because what Hungary was able to, they've in the last couple of years have seen actually a collapse in their birth rate. So, but they were able to stop the decline, get a flat line while the rest of Europe was falling. But now they're sort of back on that downward trajectory.
Mhm,
So it seems like if you look really closely, what I suspect you will find is they, through lots of money and marriage promotion, they helped couples get married sooner and have babies sooner without necessarily driving up the actual birth rate in the long run, except among people who were very family oriented, which mostly meant religious people. So imagine the religious working class couple in Budapest or right outside of Budapest who's in a small house and they have two kids and they go to church every Sunday. And they said, if we just had a little more room or a little more certainty about the future, we would have kids number 3 and 4. Hungary has successfully helped that family grow to be its size. What I don't think anybody has done is the person who says, I just can't afford a family, say, no, you can. Here's some money. Because I don't think that reason that's given of affordability, I think that's often a surface cover story. Not a cover story of like, I'm just lazy and I want to sit on the couch, maybe, but I don't like to assign. I think there's more going on there. France had the highest birth rate in all of Europe, still has, and they do it through a ton of money, including basically a stay-at-home mom benefit. And so so they have also basically free childcare, but most families choose that the mom is going to not work up until the youngest is about 3, and the government basically subsidizes that. So if you are willing to spend a ton of money, you can slightly drive up your birth rate in that way. Israel does it through more culture. I mean, they have government programs. They make childbirth paid for by the taxpayer, so it's free to the parents. And but there, it spreads throughout the whole culture. You are expected to bring your kids places. You're expected to get married and have kids. And it's not just sort of the nagging Jewish grandmother idea. It's actually 70% of Israelis get help from the grandparents. Well, it's like 35 in the rest of Europe. And even secular Jews in Israel have a higher birth rate, 2.0, than any country in Europe than the US or Canada. And so it's diffused throughout the whole culture. But also, when they build housing in Israel, they build it with an eye to family. Like there will be a kindergarten, there will be an enclosed playground for the little kids. And then they also just have more of a free range attitude, and an attitude that other parents have a duty to also look out for your kids. So one guy said, it's common practice that a 6-year-old will walk to school. It's also known that a 6-year-old is not allowed to cross a street by himself. So you will walk up to a crosswalk and there will be a kindergartner there waiting for the next adult to take his hand and walk him across the street. That seems unthinkable in Manhattan, where I'm from, but like that cultural stuff. Housing is the place where economics and policy most directly interact with this. And the related point, though, is also going to be sort of, can the kids get around? Is it walkable and bikeable for kids? And that's something that I absolutely want to study next. It's one thing that Utah really tries to do in a lot of communities, is to say, we want kids to be free and running around and not have to be driven everywhere by their parents.
Very good, Tim. Well, one final question for you. If you were advising policymakers here in Canada or the US, which you probably do, what would be your top 3 recommendations for making housing not just more affordable, but more conducive to family formation, to strengthen families and communities?
Well, anytime you're building new housing, build sidewalks and playgrounds. Come on, like my kids have to walk in the street to get to the nearest playground here in Northern Virginia. So think about that. Think about how can you make it so that if dad's working from home and mom is out at the office, and the kids can get home from school at 3 p.m. and then go down to the basketball court and play pickup, or go and walk to the library or ride their bikes to the library. So that would be one thing. 2, acknowledge, and this is a broader point of the previous point, just think about families. not everybody's going to get married. Not everybody's going to have kids. So you might feel like it's discriminatory to emphasize families, but we have a low and falling birth rate here and in Canada. We have a low, people are delaying marriage and not getting married as much. So this is an actual crisis that deserves your attention. Just like a lot of politicians put climate first, I would say put family formation first. So think about regulations that don't simply try to increase the supply of housing, but try to increase the supply of housing that's conducive for families that are just starting or families that are
Mhm.
expanding. And so that would be just the main way that I would approach it, is to think of that couple that's 24, that's 26, that wants to get married, and think, what do they need?
Mm.
And start with that.
That's great, Tim. Really enriching discussion. Before we close, where can people find more about your work and what projects are you working on next?
Sure. So I'm a columnist at the Washington Examiner, washingtonexaminer.com. I write about these issues: culture, politics. American Enterprise Institute, I'm a fellow there. They support my books. My two most recent books you mentioned, Alienated America, Family Unfriendly. Both of them are available online at any bookseller. And that's where you'll find my stuff going forward. What I really am starting to drill down on: what is family friendly housing policy? So sort of a YIMBY, yes in my backyard, but like yes kids on my front lawn, I guess maybe what it would be called.
Not as good an acronym, but I like
No.
it. Well, that's great. Thanks so much, Tim. Really great to have you join us here today. And thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.